So just a few days ago, Ukraine received permission to begin using Western-supplied weapons to strike targets inside of Russian territory. So today, we're going to talk about a couple of those different weapon systems, their capabilities, what they're likely to be used against inside of Russia, and the overall impact this is likely to have on the war. So the news stated that the Biden administration has quietly given Ukraine permission to strike inside of Russia solely near the area of Kharkiv using U.S.-provided weapons. And that's really important, the location that the U.S. is restricting Ukraine to here. That'll play into the analysis here in a minute. They said the president recently directed his team to ensure that Ukraine is able to use U.S. weapons for counter-fire purposes in Kharkiv, so Ukraine can hit back at Russian forces hitting them or preparing to hit them. Some of the officials here added that the policy of not allowing long-range strikes inside of Russia has not changed. So again, that's going to be a key component as we look into what Ukraine is likely to strike in the coming days, weeks, and months. Now, when we're talking about Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities that have been provided by the West, it generally falls into one of two systems. You have the Storm Shadow or Scalp missile system, and then the ATACMS. The Storm Shadow is UK, the Scalp is the French name for that weapon system. There's a handful of countries that possess this capability, and a handful have sent it to Ukraine. The Storm Shadow is a long-range air-launched cruise missile. It has a unclassified range out to 250 kilometers and carries a 1,000-pound unitary warhead. Unitary warhead means that it's a singular charge, essentially, right? The alternative here is going to be the cluster munition warhead that the ATACMS has the capability of carrying. Now, the ATACMS is the Army Tactical Missile System, U.S. manufactured and provided here. It's a tactical ballistic missile with a unitary or cluster munition warhead. The unitary warhead on the ATACMS is 500 pounds, so roughly half the size of the Storm Shadow warhead, and the ATACMS has an unclassified range out to 300 kilometers. It's important to say unclassified range for both of those because the exact range of these weapon systems is never public information, right? So whether it is just a little bit beyond that or a lot beyond that is something that the Russians are going to have to, and the rest of our adversaries around the world are going to have to guess about. But we don't want them to know that at 301 kilometers, they're outside the range of some of these weapon systems. So a couple thoughts when comparing these two different systems and how they might be utilized in the coming days, weeks, and months. Generally speaking, intercepting ballistic missiles is a bit harder than intercepting cruise missiles. There's just fewer types of systems that are capable of doing that. I'm not an air defense expert. I know somebody who is, so if you have any questions on that front, head over to HLC. I'm sure he's got you covered. We also have to consider area versus point targets. So an area target, as an example, could be a single headquarters building, one point location. Whereas an area target, and we're going to get into this here in a second, could be an airfield. You want to knock out multiple aircraft parked along an airfield. So you have to look at the type of munition being used based off the type of target that you are attacking. So the Storm Shadow missile has something called the Broach Penetrator Warhead, which is ideal for striking, bunker complexes or hardened positions to where it penetrates the outer layer of that facility, and then there's a delayed fuse to where the majority of the warhead detonates once it's inside of the structure. So, great use for, again, bunkers, headquarters facilities, hardened structures of that sort. We also have to keep in mind that the ATACMS are much older weapons than the Storm Shadows. So there's no indication that any of the ATACMS have been failing at this point, but you have to keep that back in mind that it's much more likely you're going to have some sort of weapons malfunction or failure or guidance system failure with an older system like ATACMS than the newly produced Storm Shadow. Just something that I'm sure the Ukrainian targeters are keeping in mind as they're looking at everything here. Now, when we're looking at what is in range of these Ukrainian weapon systems, or Western-provided, Ukrainian-possessed weapon systems, I thought it was worth pulling up a map here. We're going to go off of Deep State Map to be able to measure some of these distances. First off, I haven't talked about HIMARS. That's been in use for a while now in the war, and there are some areas where it could play a role, but generally speaking, especially if you look in the east, you don't really have to worry about HIMARS. Russia doesn't really have to worry about HIMARS striking targets inside of Russia because the unclassified range of the standard HIMARS munition is around 90 kilometers, and if you look at some of these now buffer zones between Russia and Ukraine, the standard Gimler's Mike 3-1 munition is not going to be able to range anything inside of Russia, right? So we've seen a lot of HIMARS use inside of these occupied territories of Ukraine that are inside the range of the Mike 142. But until you really get up here into Belgorod, the HIMARS generally at this point is not going to be ranging into Russian territory. Now, this area here, north of Kharkiv, is where the United States has now given Ukraine permission to strike Russian targets. And we did actually see just yesterday some pictures start to come out showing what looks like an S-400 air defense system inside of Belgorod that was successfully targeted by what looks like a HIMARS strike. This was kind of weird reporting. We've definitely got pictures of something burning. These were circulating on Russian Telegram channels as well as Ukrainian. The Russian channels said it was a HIMARS. The Russian Ministry of Defense said they shot down all the HIMARS in the Belgorod region. So the normal, right? We usually tend to see that. Now, a couple other key notes here looking at the map. I feel like it's worth noting that Ukraine has had a lot of restrictions placed on them in terms of what they can and cannot use Western-provided weapons for. They've abided by that so far. It's something that needs to be considered, of course, but it's been a long time since Ukraine first acquired the HIMARS, and it looks like just yesterday was the first time a HIMARS rocket landed inside of Russian territory, or at least Russian territory prior to the 2022 invasion. Now, I do want to note, when looking at any of these targets for these new weapon systems, Moscow is generally out of range. So when we're looking, again, at the Storm Shadow and a Storm Shadow of around 250-kilometer range, the ATACMS of around a 300-kilometer range, Moscow at its closest is over 400 kilometers away. So again, we're looking at unclassified ranges. Maybe technically Moscow could be within reach. That's not really in the cards for a couple different reasons at this point. The other thing I want to bring up before we dive into the specific targets is I'm not going to mention anything about Crimea here. It wasn't mentioned in the U.S. report that they just brought up, and Ukraine has been using ATACMS to strike targets all across Crimea for quite a while now. So it seems like the U.S. policy is that, and the NATO policy when looking at these weapon systems being used by Ukraine, is that Crimea is fair game. They're not viewing Crimea as Russian territory, whereas the recent strike into Belgorod, the Mike 142 strike into Belgorod, was viewed as striking inside of Russia. Now, when looking at the types of targets that Ukraine is likely to target inside of Russia, you have to imagine they're going to be going after high-value targets. That is something that is critical to Russia carrying out their war in Ukraine. So on one hand, it might be tempting to try to hit a troop transport, say 175 kilometers inside of Russian lines, and kind of stoke fear that at any point these troops could be targeted. That's not going to change the battlefield, at all. And Ukraine has to keep in mind that they have a limited number of these munitions, and they want to use them in ways that are most likely to achieve effects, not get shot down, and have the highest impact in the battlefield. So in looking at that, there's really 5 types of targets that I think Ukraine is going to prioritize here in the near future. Starting out, we have rail hubs, logistics, trying to find any way to stop the Russian forces from continuing to advance in certain areas of the front, or being able to resupply their forces, be it with ammunition, food, or personnel, anywhere near the front lines. So Ukraine now has the capability to strike further inside of Russian territory, disrupt some of those logistics trains. This is something that we saw the HIMARS do early in the war, able to disrupt kind of supply points throughout occupied portions of Ukraine before Russia moved those further back. We might see something very similar right now, especially up here around Kharkiv. The second major one is fuel depots. We've already seen Ukraine strike a handful of these across Russia. I'm not sure what fuel depots sit in this general area of Belgorod and Kursk across from Kharkiv. Of course, if Ukraine is going to limit these strikes to anything that affects that Russian push in Kharkiv, it's really just going to be looking in this area. But any fuel depots, supply points that are hit in that area would have a very near-term impact on the Russian offensive. Another one that's not really easy to call out on the map would be weapons production facilities, right? So if there's a weapons production facility inside of, say, 250 kilometers from this border near Kharkiv, I could absolutely see it being targeted by Ukrainian forces. Again, not clear to me exactly where those facilities sit all across Russia. So there may not be any weapons production facilities inside of that range circle. And then the 2 big ones that I think are probably going to be on the receiving end of ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes here in the very near future are command and control centers and Russian airfields. So starting with command and control centers, there's a big one that comes to mind that is now all of a sudden in range, and that is the headquarters of the Russian Southern Military District here in Rostov-on-Don. This is the area that Prigozhin moved the Wagner forces through. If you remember when he kicked off that mutiny back in June of last year, that is not technically right across the border from Kharkiv, not by a long shot, but there could be an argument made that this is one of the Russian military headquarters overseeing the forces in Ukraine. Therefore, it is tied to the offensive in Kharkiv. It's notable either way that all of a sudden a major Russian military headquarters is in range of these Ukrainian weapon systems. In terms of more local headquarters, you might have some battalion, brigade, or division level staff throughout Belgorod that is now in range, maybe even with HIMARS. Now, the other one I wanted to shift over to, and I think this is almost guaranteed that we're going to see in the near future, are significant strikes against Russian airfields. So we've got this pretty cool map here from the Rendelli Foundation. I'll link this in the description if anybody wants to check it out, showing kind of fixed Russian locations, base locations around the world. We're going to do away with land forces, naval forces. They're already striking the Black Sea Fleet. That's nothing new. Air defense forces, and here we go. So we'll zoom in. Now, I want to note that the range ring does include now Belarus, essentially. Ukraine could strike just about anywhere in Belarus, but according to the statements put out, the secret statements put out, it's only things in Kharkiv. So I would be surprised if Ukraine starts using Storm Shadows or ATACMS to strike airfields in Belarus. So what I want to key in on are a couple of these Russian airfields here that are now specifically in range. So we've got let's see, here's the first one, the Shkoyva Air Base. This one has the Tu-22 long-range strategic bombers in range now of ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles. Moving a little bit further to the south and east, talking about the direct impact that these aircraft would have on the battle in Kharkiv. You've got the Kursk airfield, a significant airfield with, among other things, Su-30 fighters there. And we've got two or three more here. The Lipetsk airfield with Su-34s, Su-35s with a variety of other aircraft also in range. The Baltimore airfield with Su-34s, reconnaissance aircraft, and additional resources is also in range. I believe this is a training base, so that one doesn't work. The Lipetsk 2, I think, is right out here. There we go. This is right on the border. It might be outside of the range. It depends where Ukraine would fire these munitions from. But Su-34s, Su-35s, these are all aircraft heavily involved with the air war over Ukraine, of course. Entirely possible, I think, that some of these airfields, specifically to the north of Kharkiv, start receiving strikes from the ATACMS, especially the ATACMS, here in the next couple days or weeks. All of these could be targeted by the Storm Shadow, but what we've seen in the past are strikes carried out by the ATACMS dropping these cluster munitions, able to destroy multiple aircraft parked outside on these Russian airfields. So we've seen the use cases. It exists. It's been effective before. It's probably going to be used again. We have seen some pictures recently that Russia has began adding kind of limited hardened structures, roof a little bit, kind of some small corrugated roof structure, it looks like, over some of these aircraft that will help protect them a little bit for sure. And it's hard to tell from the satellite imagery what sort of protection is actually involved there, but it's better than what they had previously. It's not clear if this type of defensive measure has been in place or has been in place for all of the airfields, or if that's just something we're seeing play out in Crimea. Now, I do want to add, pulling back up this nifty map here, there's a lot of other locations, right? A lot of areas down here, especially in the south and east of Ukraine, that house a significant portion of the Russian rotary wing fleet. So Ka-52s, Mi-8s, Mi-28s, things like that have been used extensively in this war, especially during the Ukrainian counteroffensive this past summer. The helicopters, Russian helicopters, took a major toll on Ukrainian armor. If Ukraine is able to find a way to loop all of these into an explanation as to why they need to be struck related to Kharkiv, that could have a significant impact on the war in the very near term. Now, in backing out a little bit in terms of what this is going to mean for the war going forward, we have a blueprint for what new weapons arriving in theater generally mean. So we saw this. A great example is the HIMARS, right? So Russia knew the HIMARS was coming. They knew the capabilities, again, the unclassified range of that weapon system. But once it arrived in theater, it was pretty clear that Russia wasn't ready for it. The HIMARS strikes began hitting Russian headquarters, troop concentrations inside of Ukraine, but outside the range of previous Ukrainian capabilities. After a few months of those strikes, and supply depots, right? There were some significant supply depots just sitting out there in the open. Ukraine had a drone overhead, a couple HIMARS rockets fall on top, destroy the entire thing. So after a little while, Russia learned from that, and they made a handful of changes. They hardened their command structures. They moved troop concentrations back from the front, and they moved some of those supply lines outside of the range of HIMARS. It's probably the same that we're going to see play out here with the extended reach of the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows, at least in the Belgorod region or the areas in and around Kharkiv. So the most optimistic take, if you will, in looking at what this means going forward, is that Ukraine could significantly degrade Russian air power, especially in the areas around Kharkiv, destroying quite a few of these while they're on the ground. I mean, even the most successful campaign here won't completely eliminate all of the Russian aerial threat, but it could whittle it down quite a bit, again, especially in this Kharkiv region in the very near term. Now, the most pessimistic take is that there's a limited supply of these munitions, and Russia does have the capability to intercept Storm Shadows and ATACMS. It's entirely possible they reallocate some of their defensive resources, and Ukraine starts firing at these airfields, command and control centers, fuel depots, or something else, and they've all become much harder targets. And essentially, Ukraine expends all these munitions that they have a limited supply of, and Russia shoots all of them down. That's probably the most pessimistic take here. Outside of this is a topic for another video, if Russia decides to retaliate against the West because of this, which I don't actually think is in the cards right now. The most realistic option here is somewhere in the middle, which kind of feels like a bit of a cop-out, but just based off of how we've seen this war play out so far, what I expect to see is that Ukraine will conduct a handful of successful strikes against high-value targets in Russia. Maybe those are fuel depots, maybe they're command and control centers, maybe they're airfields, right? But over time, whether it's probably in a matter of a couple weeks, Russia will adapt. Those targets will be harder to hit, and the overall impact will kind of decrease. But at the very least, Ukraine now being able to strike inside of Russian territory does extend Russian forces just a little bit more. It forces them to look at the battlefield more in depth than they were previously, right? I mean, for the most part, outside of the occasional drones flying overhead, Russia hasn't really been hit at all by Ukrainian munitions yet at this point. Now they have to think about that. That's something. You can't completely discount that. And that spreading out of the forces is something that could try to be exploited at a later date. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. We just put out our most recent article talking about how the Russian Wagner Force rebranded to the Africa Corps and kind of is expanding their footprint across Africa, what Prigozhin's old group is up to these days. Pretty interesting read, and linked below if interested. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.